Welcome to the Detroit Lions Morning Rounds. I'm Jimmy Liao, University of Michigan Medical School graduate, lifelong Lions fan. Let's go over the Friday injury report as well as some COVID news with the NFL. Friday report, Lions versus Colts. Let's start out with the Colts. Their most significant issue is Ryan Kelly at center, who had NPs, no practices on Thursday and Friday, and is listed as questionable. So that's not a good sign for him. We'll see what happens. With the Lions, there's a concern with Taylor Decker, who had an LP on Thursday, then an NP on Friday, and he's questionable for the game. Now, we don't know which shoulder is bothering him currently. He has a history of a significant right shoulder issue in the past. He had surgery for a torn labrum in 2017 during the offseason. He missed about 4 or 5 months, missed the first 8 games of the 2017 season. So it was a big deal back then. He seems to have recovered fine from it. Hopefully this is not a flare-up of that shoulder. We'll have to keep an eye on which shoulder is bothering him currently. Now it'll be interesting to see what the Lions do with the O-line. Will Crosby go back to left tackle, Vitae to right tackle, and bring Joe Dahl back as a starter at the guard position? That may be the obvious answer. Remember, Crosby last year filled in very effectively at left tackle in the second game of the season when Taylor Decker was out with a back injury. So he has a good history of playing well at the left tackle position. Next up is Darryl Roberts, who had an LP and LP Thursday and Friday. He's questionable for the game. Now, I got to give a shout out to this guy because he's played very well this year. Typically, when the Lions are down to their 4th, 5th cornerbacks, it gets ugly out there. Guys have trouble sticking with their man. But Darryl Roberts has done a really good job this year. Every time I see him, he's close to his guy. He's played very well. He's knocked down some passes. He got an interception in the Saints game. So he's played well for us. He played 51% of snaps versus the Falcons. He's a 29-year-old guy on a 1-year minimum contract. Hopefully he's good to go, but if he's not, we might need to bring in Tony McRae. He's also played pretty well for us this year, although he played 0% of snaps last game. He wears number 34, so keep an eye out for him if Roberts can't go. Tony McRae is 27 years old, also on a 1-year minimum contract. Now, Justin Coleman is a guy who potentially could come back this Sunday. Uncertain. He hasn't been brought back off IR yet, so he's not being listed on the injury report. Desmond Trufant actually had good news on Thursday and Friday with LPs on both days. This is a good sign that he may be ready for the Vikings game next week. He'll be out for this game against the Colts because he's coming off of a fairly significant hamstring re-aggravation that has knocked him out for 2.5, 3+ weeks at this point. They're going to be careful about bringing him back again because they don't want to re-aggravate it for a second time. So hopefully he'll get in 1 or 2 FPs next week, which would suggest he's ready for the Vikings game. But there's a chance that he'll just be LP next week, miss the Vikings game, and be back for the game after that. All right, so let's talk about some COVID news with the NFL as well as college football over the past week. The Giants had 1 offensive lineman test positive, which required most of the rest of the offensive line to be quarantined. Now remember, the week before, the Raiders also had 1 O-lineman positive, and their entire starting lineup had to be quarantined for most of that week, but they were able to play in the Sunday game. Now the NFL needs to rethink how the offensive line practices if a single positive test can quarantine the entire offensive line. That's just not going to work because there's going to be a point where the entire O-line might need to miss a game, which is not really a safe thing to do and not really a great thing to make a team play with. I think they need to rethink the practices, do practices in a way so that the offensive linemen aren't falling under the close contact criteria. Now, the CDC close contact criteria is within 6 feet for a cumulative of 15 minutes over a 24-hour period. It's unsure what the NFL close contact criteria are. It's probably something similar. So they may want to do practices that are walkthroughs where guys are 6 feet apart, virtual practices, or practices where they're wearing full PPEs, full N95 masks, so that their risk is lower and they can presumably be deemed not close contacts. Now remember, John Gruden last week complained because he wanted his game postponed from the Sunday game to Monday or Tuesday because the OLine had not practiced all week. Now I agree with the NFL about not postponing the game. They can't just be postponing games anytime a team feels like it's unfair to play the game because a couple guys or a few guys are missing. Otherwise, it creates inconsistency about which games are being postponed. I think you just have to play them as scheduled. Now, we're seeing this right now in college football with Wisconsin's quarterback, Graham Mertz, who tested COVID positive. With the Big Ten rules, he's out for 21 days. Wisconsin subsequently canceled the game versus Nebraska this weekend. There was a report that Wisconsin wanted to reschedule a different game into that slot, a FCS opponent, but the Big Ten nixed that. You got to wonder if Wisconsin would have canceled the game if it was a backup linebacker that tested COVID positive. So there's inconsistency there. It's not great that teams can just cancel games whenever they want, whenever they feel like too many players are out for a game or too high of a quality of player like your starting quarterback is out for a game. The Big Ten probably should have some kind of uniform rule covering all the teams. Now, one thing to know about the Big Ten's 21-day quarantine policy is they have to be a little bit careful about that because when penalties get too punitive, you incentivize cheating or fudging the system. This means that players could become non-compliant with getting tested. The testers, who might be fans of the team, might not be as aggressive as sticking that swab deep into the sinus cavity. They might do a lighter swab around the outside of the nostril that's more likely to show up as a false negative or come back as a negative test. So the Big Ten has a significantly different quarantine policy than the rest of college football as well as the NFL. So there are pros and cons with that. Let's talk about Everson Griffen, who the Lions got in a trade this week. Due to NFL COVID policy, he's required to be quarantined for 5 days, which means he can't play this Sunday against the Colts and will only be available next week for the Vikings. I don't like this rule. It doesn't really make any sense. I would agree that quarantining a street free agent for 5 days makes sense because a street free agent is not getting tested every day, is not following the NFL rules. However, Everson Griffen has been getting tested every day, is following the same NFL rules as Lions players. So it doesn't make sense to quarantine him for a few days and have him miss the game. Now, some people speculated that his travel from Dallas to Detroit posed increased risk, but he took a private jet to Detroit. So the amount of risk there is likely very small and probably less risk than a current Lions player sending their kid to school or going to the grocery store. So I don't like the NFL rule here. I think he should be available to play versus the Colts. One thing we've seen in another sport this week is in the MLB, Justin Turner was pulled off a field during a game because his positive test returned during the game. As you may remember, the NFL a couple weeks ago started doing PCR tests the morning of a game. And at that time, I was saying it was a bad idea, and I'm still saying it's a bad idea because of what we saw with Justin Turner. We do not want to be seeing guys pulled off the field during a game. Because what if the entire offensive line has to be pulled off the field? What if all the quarterbacks need to be pulled off the field? There could be chaos on game day if an entire unit is pulled off the field and the team can't even field a complete team. I like TJ Hawkinson, but I don't want him playing center. So the NFL, I think, should be doing POC rapid tests on game day so that all the results are consistently back before the game starts. Another reason it's unfair to do the PCR test is what if results return during the game for one team but not the other? So let's say this Sunday's game, Lions-Colts, both the Lions players and the Colts players are getting tested in the morning. If the Lions results come back during the game, they have to pull off a few of the guys during the game, but the Colts results don't come back till after the game, and they don't have to pull guys off the field. That's an inequity. That's not fair. That doesn't make any sense. Another issue with the PCR tests is you may find out afterwards that a player was positive and played a whole game just a couple hours before. This creates a big-time PR and optics nightmare because you're going to be seeing replays of this COVID-positive player hugging other guys, breathing heavily, sweating all over the place, maybe getting an altercation. It's not a good situation. Other COVID news this week was Jaguars running back Ryquell Armstead, 23 years old, reportedly has been hospitalized twice for COVID this year and is going to miss the rest of the season due to COVID complications. This may be the first report I've heard of an elite pro athlete having severe issues related to COVID. So I want to caution everybody to be careful about anecdotal data. And this is an anecdotal situation. I don't have access to his medical reports. He has not released them. All we're getting is reports that this is COVID, but there may be other issues involved. We don't know for sure. Can't overreact to a single anecdotal case and can't let a single case like this affect how we treat or view the rest of the NFL. So I'm going to keep my eye on this. I'm going to keep an eye out for any other cases that get reported, but I'm not going to overreact to anecdotal cases at this point. All right. Find me on Twitter at JimmyLealMD. Feel free to leave YouTube comments. Thanks for listening.